Thank you for joining me, Chuck Moscowitz. So, why are the Jews so liberal, so darned liberal, as it were? Yesterday, I had an interview with YouTube host David, who is a self-described supporter of the Jewish false messiah Shabtai Zvi. And I think that he's a nice guy. He's well-meaning, but his comments, I think, are reveal a great deal of why Jews became so liberal, and that is that he claims that the Shabtai Zvi, who was a false messiah of the 15th, 16th century, 17th century, that he was good because he created what he calls the big tent Judaism. Judaism for everybody. We're all equal. We can all have a place at the table. And then he railed against the rabbis and the rabbinic Jews because he claimed they excommunicated people who were not observant enough and who didn't observe every jot and tittle of the Torah, which, by the way, is false. But putting that aside, if this isn't the liberal ethos, I don't know what is. All people are equal. There's no values or beliefs that separate us or make us unequal, which is what values and beliefs do, not to mention skill sets and whatever circumstance. And that the greatest virtue is to include everybody at the table, which really means why have any religion at all? Why have any faith? Because we are all different. Now, first of all, it's a myth to suggest that rabbinic Judaism and normative Judaism does not include everybody. It does. It doesn't condone, however, sin. That doesn't mean that sinners aren't included. We all recognize that we're all sinners. No one is perfectly observant. That's impossible. Only God is perfect. And that many of us do consciously choose to be not observant in certain ways, and some of us even choose sin. And we have to pay a price for that psychically and spiritually. I'd give the example of if someone chooses to not maintain kosher standards in the privacy of their own home, then that's fine. That's not good. They lower their own holiness and their own spiritual level, but that's a personal choice. They're still Jewish. They're still part of the congregation, and that we hope and pray that they raise their spiritual level. Even if someone goes out publicly and has dinner at a non-kosher restaurant, that's worse, but it's still permissible in the broad sense, in that they've chosen not to observe these kosher laws, and they run the risk of damaging their soul and lowering their level of holiness, and as such, lowering the community's level. But the difference is that what the Shabtai Zvi did, the false messiah, is he did the equivalent of declaring ham kosher. It's one thing to have ham, but don't pretend that it's kosher. He sought to overthrow the Torah, to uproot the Torah, to make a new Torah, if you will, but by simply declaring it as such. That's how he launched his messiahship in 1664, or whenever it was. He went to the bima at his local synagogue in Smyrna, which was part of the Ottoman Empire, and he publicly violated the Torah. Now, I don't know exactly what he did. My understanding is that he intoned the name of God in public, which is forbidden, because only God knows the name of God. We're not supposed to try to do that. And then he went on, according to most sources, to engage in any and all sorts of violations of Torah precepts, orgies, forbidden sexual relationships, corrupt business relationships, any opportunity he had to violate the Torah, he took it on. The idea was that there are two ways to bring about the Messianic age to the degree that it's possible to bring it out. Only God can do that. And the conventional Talmudic approach is that the Jewish people and mankind generally reaches a level of holiness and a level of spirituality that we know God, we know God's moral and ethical precepts to the degree that we are ready for the advent of the Messiah and the Messianic age. The non-official approach and the non-Talmudic approach, one in legend, is that man descends to such a low level of depravity that the Messiah comes to save mankind. And God will never completely destroy man for that, because that practice ended, according to Torah itself, after the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, and after the flood, I should say. But the point is that that's what Shabtai Zvi tried to do. He tried to claim his messiahship by leading an effort to degrade man, to reject God, to step away from the moral and ethical precepts of the Torah, to make everybody equally sinful, and to declare sin as good. Now, in case people think this is something unique to Judaism, there were Christian movements that did the same thing. Satanism is an example. It sought to subvert the Mass by creating a black Mass. Everything in the Catholic tradition would be turned on its head. The Illuminati emanated from the Jesuit movement, and it was a rejection of Catholic and Christian, and in the broad sense, Judeo-Christian values, by claiming that the ultimate virtue was to end sovereign nations, to end God, to end the church, and to create a one world ant colony. That was, the Sabbatean movement, which emanated from Shabtai Zvi, is analogous to those movements. And it contributed greatly to the emergence in the 20th century of a secular ethos that includes communism, Nazism, and I would even argue radical Islam. This idea that man can perfect the earth through force, that we reject the sovereignty of heaven and our own limitations and our own sin and our own vulnerability to it, and we create a perfect man by removing the laws of the Torah, which we cannot fulfill. Therefore, we have to abolish them. I mean, that was the Shabtai Zvi's main movement. And of course, when he was exposed as a false messiah by the Sultan in Constantinople, most Jews realized that he was a false messiah and utterly rejected his mission. But there was a remnant that remained and converted to Islam with him, and developed secret societies and conducted themselves in secret. They're called the Sabbatians. And then in the 18th century, a follower of Shabtai Zvi, a European Catholic, who converted to Catholicism by the name of Jacob Frank, led the Frankist movement, a revival of the Shabtai Zvi movement. And these things contributed greatly to modern secular ethos, this idea that a rejection of God and a rejection of the Torah and all of its precepts, and an acceptance of that morality can be created out of whole cloth by human hands, what we call moral relativism. And of course, this is the very same principle that the Torah itself warns us about in its warning about the dangers of idol worship, of worshiping graven images. I mean, a graven image is a man-made image. In other words, it's man attempting to replace God with his own control of the universe. He decides what's true and what's not true. He decides what's real and what's not real. There is no immutable, objective truth that is outside of the manipulative and imperfect hand of man. There is no God, in other words, that man becomes God. This is the heresy that goes right back to the Garden of Eden. I mean, it was the serpent in the garden that induced Eve to partake of the forbidden fruit against God's command, and thus embraced the promise by the serpent that man can be as God, that we can know good and evil. In other words, we can know all the mysteries of the universe just like God, and essentially we can overthrow God. That is the heresy that has continued in every generation ever since. That is the heresy that represents the communist idea. And that is the very thing that the entire history of the ancient Israelite and Jewish movement has sought to reject. And yet, since Shabtai Zvi, it is that selfsame movement that has made such inroads into Judaism and has had such a corrupting influence in Judaism that it's a real difficult fight. It's not lost, but I think that people like myself in my own small way with the show, but other more important people that are Jews are trying to identify and expose this heresy to this day and how corrupting it is on our body politic and on our faith, that we are imperfect servants of God. We are not going to create a perfected world where all people are equal. That's not possible. We've seen the results of those experiments. Now, I just want to conclude by bringing up one other thing, and that is that I was listening to an interview with E. Michael Jones, who is a great scholar and whom I admire immensely, but who I think is way off base on his analysis of Judaism, and I've talked about that. And he was saying that he was complaining, and accurately, that medicine, that the modern medicine has been taken over by capitalists and has become a business, a money-making business. So the doctor is no longer treating the patient and looking at the patient for what is best for them and their unique circumstance. Instead, the doctor is acting as a salesman for some product, whether it be a procedure or whether it be a drug. And they say, well, we have to do X number of x-rays or X number of drugs or whatever it is per month in order to reach a quota. And he blames that on capitalism, and he blames capitalism on the Jews. Now, first of all, I just want to comment briefly on this. Capitalism is natural to man. It is part of who we are. We have self-interest. We want to earn profits so that we can have more control over our own lives and inheritance and our destinies and that of our families. Those are good, virtuous elements of human nature. Those exist in the animal kingdom. Animals understand this. I mean, the beaver gathers sticks to build a dam. They understand property. You don't evade the dam once they build it unless you want big trouble. A dog understands this. You don't invade his space. Property, ownership. Those are inherent aspects of human nature. But the problem with capitalism, and Dr. Jones accurately identifies this in his complaint about medicine, is that there is a tendency, one that became more codified in the 18th century, to separate the capitalist impulse from moral and ethical codes of Sinai, which is basically the Western code that may be different in a Buddhist country, and I accept that. But the point is, it removes the capitalist impulse from the proper constraints that are provided by religion being organized faith, and by faith in general, that are necessary to make the capitalist system work in all of its imperfections. So if you remove that moral aspect, then it becomes strictly a matter of material. How much money do I have? How do I get it? There is no moral constraint. And the other natural constraint, which is also biblically based to capitalism, is government. Limited local, particularly government, elected representative government, where the people of a community, preferably, but of a state and even of a nation, maintain the right to regulate capitalism, regulate business in such a way that protects interests. Because after all, if you have capitalism, you have conflicting interests. My capitalist right to earn a living may conflict with yours. I mean, if I own a piece of property and I decide to build a garbage dump in the backyard, that might infringe on your right as my neighbor to not have all the bad effects of living next to a garbage dump. So we have governments that help adjudicate these conflicts and help set up contracts and honor them, and help set up regulations that reflect local values and that balance the right to earn capital, the right to own property, with the interests of that local community. So a local community can decide, we don't want to have liquor stores, The community itself may decide they don't want to have brothels. I mean, whatever it is. I mean, there's a movement right now by environmentalists to ban plastic bags in supermarkets. I support that, by the way. I don't know why a lot of conservatives are against it, because I don't think they're good environmentally. I don't think they're necessary. So I'm going to vote for a local city councilor to vote to create a law banning the use of plastic bags in supermarkets. I mean, that's where capitalism is tempered by the local government. And it's also tempered, again, equally by moral and ethical restraints. We have laws against pornography. I mean, because it's immoral, because we as a society understand that, and we don't want to expose our children to it particularly. And that's a restraint on capitalism. So when Dr. Jones talks about capitalism as being, and he blames it on the British Protestant ethos, which he also blames on the Jews, quite the opposite. Judaism, the understanding in capitalism is that in Judaism is that capitalism is constrained by the moral and ethical precepts of the Torah and by local government, because after all, local government is a biblical concept. It was set up by Jethro in Sinai when he went to Moses and said, look, you can't be a dictator. You're having a nervous breakdown, for one thing. But secondly, you can't make all the decisions. You have to relegate authority to a council of elders who will adjudicate conflict in the tribe. And that was the beginning of a limited government and divided government and a balance of power. So the concept is actually quite biblical. Adam Smith was a great man, Wealth of Nations. He identified the hidden hand of the free market. But the thing that happened as a result of his work, inadvertently probably, and by the way, he was Scottish, not Jewish, inadvertently happened, was that he created economics as a discipline separate from community, separate from morality, separate from the practical applications that are restrained by moral precepts. And that, of course, that concept was even furthered by Marx, who admired Adam Smith and incorporated his work, and then went ahead and created the class conflict theory, say pitting various groups against each other in order to reduce the amount of freedom ultimately and the amount of capitalism, which again is inherent to human nature and to people. Anyway, so thanks for listening, everyone. Charles Moscowitz, and please subscribe to my station and have a great afternoon.